All right, it makes sense to start with child and adolescence since we would kind of march through the person's life. So abnormal behavior can develop at many different times, but more often than not, things might get noticed earlier in life, obviously. All right, so chapter 13 in the book, and I'm going to be kind of walking through the textbook and walking through the DSM-4, or I'm sorry, DSM-5, which you don't have, but I'll tell you some of the highlights. So it might help you to follow along. One thing to note, and some of this is from other places too, when they talk about neurodevelopmental disorders, neurotypical is a fancy term for normal functioning or normal development. So neurodevelopmental disorder just means there's something not going correctly with the development process. So brain functioning, development has been impaired, and that is impacting development. Or I'm sorry, some impairment of brain functioning and development is impacting further development, whether that's in the biological, cognitive, or sociological, sociocultural areas. These kinds of difficulties often go unnoticed. Families just put up with it, but when they enter school is when it gets noticed, and then somebody reports it, and then somebody needs to do an evaluation, or somebody calls the doctor, things like that, to start being aware of some of these odd behaviors. And it depends on culture and the household, the culture of the household, that may or may not make some behaviors seem normal or abnormal. All right, so prevalence, 4 of 10 adolescents are diagnosable in the past year through research studies. From 6 to 17, from ages 6 to 17, the most common diagnoses are ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and learning disabilities. 1/3 get treatment. So other issues like people not wanting to admit it or insurance inabilities to pay, all that happens to the other 2/3, which is not, of course, not helpful. Just something to notice about internalized versus externalized. If you see these phrases, it just means internalized behaviors or disorders are those turned inward. They're maybe not as noticeable. It's an anxiety disorder or a depression that you are keeping within you. Maybe that leads you to just kind of cower over to the side and nobody's paying attention to you, because the externalized person, the person who's running and screaming and jumping and tearing things off the wall, is getting more attention because they need to be addressed sooner. So a lot of times internalized versus externalized has to do with how your diagnoses are manifested. Risk factors, just keep in mind they don't make it for sure that your child or you would develop a psychological disorder, but they may make it more likely, and the more of them, the more likely. So genetic influence, what is going on in the family's genes, has that been passed on? Environment, has there been serious malnutrition or neglect, or just serious stress in the family? Family factors, there's always an example in the news every year or so of somebody found in a dark room or a closet, and they had been kept there for months. And of course that impacts your psychological development. Abuse and neglect, sexual, physical, or emotional. This is also in chapter 10. There's a section about this in chapter 10, but I kind of pulled it into here because it has to do with children. But 1.5 million U.S. Child abuse and neglect cases each year, and there's 1,000 to 2,000 per year that die as a result. So it's easy to forget that lots of bad things are happening to lots of kids. So we kind of have to keep that on the forefront if we're going to be in that field working to support children, knowing that some of these risk factors may be in their lives, so that we would know when to report it and how to intervene. All right, autism spectrum disorder is an example, and obviously in a class like this, we can't go into much detail, but we get the general idea of psychological disorders, the broad range of them. but I think autism spectrum disorder is a very commonly, at least people are aware of it, I will say. Now, we used to have a phrase called Asperger syndrome. That has been taken away. There's not just an autism and then an Asperger's. Now it's autism spectrum disorder, which is sort of like an umbrella from high functioning autism to low functioning autism and everything in between. So it's a range of characteristics. On page 486, there is a chart that is taken from the DSM-5 talking through what kinds of characteristics and criteria would you need to look for if you were diagnosing someone with autism spectrum. So like in section A, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, deficits in, so that would take the form of deficits in social emotional reciprocity, for example. If somebody was making eye contact with you and talking with you, you might not talk back, you might not communicate back. That wouldn't be something that would necessarily make sense to you. Deficits in nonverbal communication, deficits in maintaining relationships. Maybe you just continue talking and you're really unaware that that person is disinterested in what you have to say. That doesn't matter to you because that never occurred to you. It's just this is what is in your decision-making capacity to speak about right now. So there's communication deficits and there's social interaction deficits. There are restricted interests, like sometimes people will talk about children who just play with trains all the time, or just put certain toys together over and over and over, or just roll certain cars over and over and over. They're not really playing with them as we think of normal play. They're just repetitively engaging and restrictively engaging in different interests. And then there's also, I don't know if it's listed in there, but oh, okay, there it is. B, number 4, the hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input. This is where like certain textures they cannot stand and cannot have. The tag in your shirt or a certain type of food like a water chestnut, for example. Temple Grandin is one of the most famous cases of a person with autism spectrum disorder. I think one of your assignments will probably have to do with her in a little bit. The phrase savant gets tossed around. That is where there may not be good skills in a lot of areas, but there's like one skill, like the child can count. The child can tell you all the dates of whenever anything happened. Like they can, you can say, I was born in 1942 or something, and then they'll be like, oh, that was a Wednesday, the day that you were born. They have this odd ability to access a certain very restricted type of information. And essentially, that is that's like that movie Rain Man. That is what that's the example that people have in their minds of people with autism. It's still with us in society. That is not the norm. That is just certain people have these splinter skills, and they would be considered savants, but they may not have good skills in any other area. It just might be that. There's plenty of other things to say. If some of you have ideas or information about autism, certainly email me with questions or say something on a forum. Intellectual disability is the new phrase for mental retardation. Because of the negative stereotypes that have been connected to the MR diagnosis for years, they did away with it, with that phrase. It's intellectual disability. Sometimes you'll see like cognitive deficit or cognitive impairment. Different places will have different ones, but generally intellectual disability is the one that it's changed to. And on page 492, we have you have your levels. You can see mild, moderate, severe, profound, how much intellectual disability exists. It's not just your IQ, your intelligence quotient. It is also your adaptive functioning. Can you take care of yourself? Can you go to the grocery store? Like those activities of daily living we talked about in another video. I talked about the levels. The causes, I'll let you look through page 492 through 495. You can kind of just scan through to see a few different chromosomal and prenatal and cultural factors. Specific learning disabilities, in general, reading, math, and writing are the main three, or maybe the only three in DSM. Um, the discrepancy model can be used, but it is not required. But it's basically saying if you have a certain IQ, then we would expect your achievement levels to be at that level. If your IQ is, say, a 100 and your writing skills are 70, then that's 30 points discrepant. And if they thought they should both be 100, then that suggests that maybe you have a writing learning disability. And there's a lot more to that, but you get the basic idea, I think, of a child who's just falling behind in math, reading, or writing and has difficulty understanding how to do that. And that is usually, hopefully, seen in school and then addressed. Communication disorders, these sometimes are much more addressed by the speech-language pathologist than the school psychologist or the psychologist, but nevertheless, they are examples of abnormal psychology. They are in the DSM system. So, like a speech impediment, which is called speech sound disorder, childhood onset fluency disorder, was a fancy phrase for stuttering, social pragmatic communication disorder. That's suggesting that you have difficulty making yourself understood and/or difficulty understanding what people are saying to you, and that often, as you can imagine, goes along with autism. Behavioral concerns are in this neurodevelopmental chapter. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Sometimes you'll see ADD versus ADHD. It's technically ADHD, and you would specify whether it's inattentive or hyperactive more, or a combination of the two. But essentially, it's as is explained on page 503 in your book. A lack of attention, readily distracted, trouble staying organized, hyperactivity, fidgeting with hands or feet, leaving a chair constantly, impulsive, calling out, or doing things without thinking through the consequences. Another behavioral concern, oppositional defiant disorder versus conduct disorder. So those are persistently not following rules or having respect for other people. So defying, like a young child who might be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, defying the classroom rules might take the form of tearing something off the bulletin board or kicking the teacher or spitting at a classmate on recess. That might grow into conduct disorder if the child ages and doesn't get these behaviors under control. And that might expand into worse areas like vandalism, bullying, beating other people up, neighborhood cats going missing, bad things that don't necessarily automatically happen, but certainly become more likely if the child's anger and behaviors and conduct are not under control. These two can eventually lead to antisocial personality disorder, which we'll talk about in the personality section. The other one mentioned in your book, separation anxiety disorder, on page 509, just mentioned that it shows up in children. They're diagnosed when the level of fear or anxiety associated with separation from a caregiver or attachment figure is persistent and excessive for the child's developmental level. So being dropped off at school to kindergarten, and you've done this on a regular basis, and you're just screaming and throwing a fit and hanging on to the parent, is suggestive of some sort of relational not disability, but disruption in the family, and is something to look into, even if it's not its own diagnosis. Other things from DSM-5, just to make you aware of, global developmental delay is a phrase that sometimes gets used when they have a young child and they know there are problems with the child's development, but they're not sure what is going on. So they might give them a global developmental delay until they figure out more what is going on. That might have language delays, motor delays, cognitive delays, any combination. They use the phrase unspecified. So an unspecified intellectual disability might just mean that they didn't meet all the criteria in the book for full intellectual disability, but we know that there's something going on there, and we want to identify that and then work toward addressing it. And then unspecified can be put in front of many of the disorders. And then there's things like developmental coordination disorder, the idea that executing and coordinating motor skills is substantially impacted. Stereotypic movement disorder, repetitive, purposeless motor behavior like handshaking, body rocking, head banging. That's something that's often connected to someone with a diagnosis of autism. But basically, they would give that if somebody had that, but not other symptoms. But there's a connection there. A tic disorder can include Tourette's. A tic itself is a sudden, rapid, non-rhythmic motor movement or vocalization. You've seen these kids that make these sounds, these just sounds that I'm sure you've been somewhere where someone has they could have a throat clearing tic or just a little burst. If you've ever seen Malcolm in the Middle, that child, the youngest child, is a perfect example of someone who has tics. He has to do a little whoop under his breath on a regular basis, and it becomes something that they just have to do, and it becomes part of their daily function. But Tourette's disorder is an example of a tic disorder where multiple motor and at least one or more vocal tics are present, and then they may come and go in frequency but have at least persisted for 1 year, and they came on before age 18, and they're not attributable to some other diagnosis. So the criteria like that help walk you through it.